What is your geographical definition of the Middle East? What nations do you identify as Middle Eastern? Where are the borders? I'm Regina Higgins, Outreach Director for the Duke UNC Consortium for Middle East Studies. Let's explore just where this term Middle East came from and how it developed. The term Middle East grew from two English terms, Near East, which referred to the eastern Mediterranean region nearest Europe, an area controlled for centuries by the Ottoman Empire, and Far East, Asian lands including China and Japan, lying east of India, farthest from Europe. Middle East, then, refers to a territory between the Near East and the Far East, but it was and remains a region without distinct boundaries. So when someone uses the term Middle East, it's a good idea to find out exactly what they mean. The term Middle East was first used publicly in 1902 in an article by Alfred T. Mahan, a U.S. naval officer known for his expertise in global strategies. Let's take a look at the Middle East as Mahan saw it. As you can see, Mahan's Middle East includes the Arabian Peninsula, but it doesn't include several of the nations we'd identify as Middle Eastern today. Much of Egypt, for instance, is outside Mahan's Middle East, and so are the territories that became modern-day Lebanon, Syria, northern Iraq, and northern Iran. Just to make things simpler, this map notes the modern states and borders, except for the newest nation, South Sudan. I'll be referring to them by these names. The whole map seems to lean rather farther to the south and the east than we'd expect. For example, while some would include Pakistan in the Middle Eastern region, as Mahan does here, at least the southern part closest to the Arabian Sea, few would include India and Sri Lanka, and even fewer the nations of Southeast Asia included here. So how did the borders of this Middle East come to be drawn? They were determined by the strategic argument Mahan was presenting. In the article introducing the term Middle East, Mahan was focusing on the defense of the Suez Canal, the passage created by the British as a gateway to Asia. He was calling on the British to protect the canal from Russian, German, and possibly even American competitors by using the powerful British Navy to control this sea route. And so the borders of Mahan's Middle East are defined by his purpose. It's less a conventional geographical region and more of a strategic zone, a zone defined by the sea route from Suez to Singapore, the gateway to the rich Asian trade Great Britain depended on for its wealth and power, and those lands closest to that sea route. In this sense, the term, as Mahan uses it here, doesn't refer to a region, at least in the way we most commonly understand it. We think of a region as an area defined geographically by similar characteristics, physical, natural, human, or cultural. Apart from its relative location, Mahan's Middle East doesn't describe the geography of a region at all. And it certainly doesn't tell us anything about the culture of the peoples living there. It's used exclusively in the context of British defense strategy. Less than a year later, Times writer Valentin Chiral also used the term Middle East. Let's look at the map as Chiral drew it. Chiral's Middle East is also very different from ours. Here, Syria and Jordan lie west of the boundary line. Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan are included, but the only part of the Arabian Peninsula designated as Middle East is its eastern coast. That's more than a little surprising. We usually think of the entire Arabian Peninsula as an essential, even central part of the Middle East. Chiral seems to be focused far to the east of where we'd expect. His Middle East extends eastward to include Nepal and even southwest China. Why these borders for the Middle East? Remember Mahan's use of the term. He wasn't describing physical or cultural characteristics, but a strategic zone. Chiral was doing the same in drawing his map of the Middle East. He defined the Middle East as those regions of Asia which extend to the borders of India or command the approaches to India and which are consequently bound up with the problems of Indian political as well as military defense. So once again, Middle East refers to political and defense strategy of a world power outside the region. Two world powers, in fact, because the Middle East, as Chiral defines it, is the region between the territory controlled by the Russian Empire and the territory controlled by the British Empire. The Middle East, in Chiral's view, was the frontier on which these two world powers might play out their rivalry, known as the Great Game. Who else has drawn a map of the Middle East, and what was the purpose? In 1920, Britain's Royal Geographic Society set these boundaries for the Middle East and distinguished that region very carefully from the Near East. The Near East is blue, and the Middle East is red. The Near East, it's clear, is limited to Europe, more specifically the southeast, once controlled by the Ottoman Empire. The line of demarcation is that famous crossroads, Istanbul, Turkey. In 1920, according to the Royal Geographic Society, the Middle East region extends south to include the entire Arabian Peninsula and east to the border of what is now Pakistan, but would then have been India. This is a map that looks much more familiar to us, and yet there are some interesting differences. Do you see that Egypt is not included? This is a continuing debate. Although Egypt is culturally part of the Middle East, ethnically Arab and Arabic-speaking, geographically it's part of the African continent as well. And so some scholars and organizations place Egypt and the rest of North Africa outside the Middle East. The U.S. State Department takes a different view. It does include North Africa, as you can see, but not Turkey. And the U.S. State Department now calls this region displayed here the Near East and doesn't use the term Middle East at all. Let's hold on to this map for just a moment and do some thinking about culture. This is the U.S. State Department map of the Near East. If you were to draw a map of the regions influenced by Islam, how would it be different from this map? You'd include the Arabian Peninsula, of course, just as here, and North Africa too. But in the east, would you stop with Iran? You'd include Afghanistan and Pakistan and India to the south, and the Central Asian nations to the north. In Africa, you'd include the northmost countries, just as here, but you'd also extend southward to include Mali, Sudan, and Somalia. Turkey isn't featured in this map, but it would be in the Islam map. And so would the southern portion of Spain and southeastern Europe. It's a far larger area. Perhaps the most extensive Middle East regional map is drawn by the Middle East Studies Association, a scholarly organization. MESA defines the cultural Middle East as regions in which Islam has played an important cultural role. And because academic research on Middle Eastern history, art, religion, and culture often involves parts of the world beyond the region, this map includes the Iberian Peninsula, southeastern Europe, North Africa, quite a lot of East Africa, and even parts of South Asia. These territories share Middle Eastern ties through cultural exchange, chiefly because of trade and the expansion of Islamic empires. We've come a long way from Alfred Mann's view of the Middle East. Do you remember it? Then as now, borders of a region are drawn for particular reasons that may not be apparent at first. It's important to question why boundaries of a region are drawn where they are and what purpose they serve. To learn more about the definitions of the Middle East as a region, go to middleeast.unc.edu/where/. There you'll find more 20th century maps of the Middle East and the reasons for their borders. You can also find out more about our programs and resources for learning about the Middle East at ncmideast.org/outreach. For the Duke UNC Consortium for Middle East Studies, this is Outreach Director Regina Higgins. Thanks for coming along to explore the Middle East.